It's worked so far, but we're not out yet.
I wanna know what you're thinking. There are some things you can't hide. I wanna know what you're feeling. Tell me what's on your mind.
Pure energy.
Hailing frequencies open, and welcome to Enterprising Individuals, the Star Trek discussion podcast that boldly goes into excruciating detail about the series, characters, and stories of the Star Trek universe. I'm your host, Caliban, and I want to remind you that although poker does have advantages over chess, pinochle is the deadliest game of them all. I'm joined on this episode by David R. George III. David is the author of many Star Trek novels, including stories set in the original series era, Deep Space Nine, and the Lost Era adventures of the Enterprise B under Captain John Herrmann. His most recent novel, The Long Mirage, is a DS9 novel, and joins his other two DS9 novels, Sacraments of Fire and Ascendance. He's also a former contributor to Star Trek Magazine, and along with Eric Stillwell, wrote the story for the first season Voyager episode, Prime Factors. Dave, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Permission to come aboard granted. Today we'll be talking about the Corbomite Maneuver, the 10th episode of the first season of Star Trek, the original series, which was, as we'll discuss today, the first production episode of Trek's inaugural season, having been shot almost a year after the show's second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before. And as such, it's an episode that has a very different feel than a lot of classic Trek episodes. It features many on-screen firsts in the canon, many technical elements that were still being ironed out. It also features Corbomite, a sort of get-out-of-jail-free plot device that also appears in the second season episode, The Deadly Years. All of that, and Clint Howard to boot. But we can talk about Clint a little later in the show. First, I'd like to know your backstory. How did you become a Star Trek fan? What's your history with Trek?
You know, I grew up watching Star Trek. My dad was a big science fiction fan, and so he introduced me to Star Trek, introduced me to all sorts of science fiction, and I just sort of liked that from the beginning. And also the space program, the space shuttle, all of these things were intriguing to me, in the real world, and the science fiction just complemented that. So I watched Star Trek for a long time. I have been. I still watch Star Trek.
Sure, yeah, of course.
And actually, the Corbomite Maneuver, as it turns out, happens to be the very first episode of Star Trek I ever saw.
Really? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I'm always fascinated by people who become astronauts or scientists, based on their inspiration, seeing the intrepid heroes of Trek who are warriors, but they are, scientists and explorers as well, and the way that inspires people to do stuff. It inspired me to make an internet podcast, but, to each their own. I've also been fascinated by the character of John Herrmann that you've written a lot about, and not solely because he's played by the affable Alan Ruck, Cameron from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, of course. But when we first encounter him, he's fairly unsure of himself, and he doesn't seem like somebody who can handle the command of the Enterprise. And his career as captain of the Excelsior-class Enterprise remains fairly unexplored. There's only a couple novels and short stories to feature him. I think you're probably the resident expert on him. Can you talk about what you wanted to accomplish with him as a character?
Oh, absolutely. And what I wanted to accomplish was very clear in my mind, too, because watching him in his first appearance in the movie Generations, he was absolutely unsure of himself. And I don't think that was so much a product of conscious writing as sort of the artifact of wanting to make Captain Kirk look better.
Yeah, right.
And I didn't really like that myself, just as a fan. It's perfectly fine to show that Captain Kirk is a great and wonderful leader, but you don't have to do that, I don't think, at the expense of other characters. And like I say, it may not have been a conscious thing, just sort of an artifact of what they were trying to do. But for me, sort of trying to look at that from a realistic perspective, it seemed odd, because you would think somebody who's going to command a starship, somebody who's going to command a destroyer today in some navy in the world, is going to be somebody who's confident, who has capabilities, who has abilities, who can do the job. And it's not the kind of job that I think allows for a great deal of trepidation. I mean, it's fine to have self-examination. That's something you want in a leader, but you don't want a leader who is not confident in their own ability. So I really wanted to explore how Herrmann could have behaved the way he did in Generations and yet still be somebody who could do that job, who was worthy of, who had earned his place aboard the Enterprise as its captain.
Sure.
So I really, really wanted to look at that. I mean, I had a whole story that, apart from that, but that was a really strong aspect of it for me.
I'm not sure if this exists in any of the written works about him, but I think the Alan Ruck, the actor, sort of speculated that it was possible that it was sort of a political appointment, and it was sort of like a stepping stone for him to go on to be like a big figure, sort of how, like, you know, my dad got me the job, like that kind of thing.
Well, I think there's absolutely an element I played with that, and I think that really originated with Peter David, who wrote a novel called The Captain's Daughter, that had Herrmann in it, and it was more a sort of a, well, I mean, it was partially a Demora Sulu story, but it was largely an Enterprise B story, and it did talk a little bit about Herrmann's father, and there was some interaction, and you could see that they did not have a good relationship, that the father was somebody who would look to, even though he was, the elder Herrmann was established in his own right and a power within Starfleet, he would also look to his son to continue that, as not so much part of what his son wanted, but as part of what the father wanted to establish or to continue the father's legacy. So there's that familial stuff, pressure that was associated with the younger Herrmann, and I sort of ran with that in Serpents Among the Ruins, which it really is. I mean, it's a Herrmann and Demora Sulu novel, but it deals a lot with that relationship and how the younger Herrmann was pressured by the elder Herrmann to sort of advance in Starfleet, and the elder Herrmann opened some doors that maybe wouldn't have opened so quickly. But I also wanted to establish the fact that the younger Herrmann was absolutely capable of doing that job.
Right.
And any sort of hesitation, any trepidation we saw from him, any lack of confidence, wasn't so much because he didn't believe in his own abilities, but it was because he was pushed forward by his father and still had an antagonistic relationship with him. And so there was a lot of other details in that that really contributed to his behavior that we saw in Generations.
Sure. And it was his first day on the job.
Yeah, and it was his first day on the job, and everything was going to be back on the ship.
No torpedoes and anything like that. Right, yeah. I really love seeing other captains of other enterprises, that when we get to see glimpses of them, like Rachel Garrett or even Robert April, and the way that clearly Starfleet officers are intrepid and wise, but the captains of the Enterprise seem to possess some extra measure of greatness that qualifies them. And, there's something a little beyond the normal Starfleet captain. And I think it's cool to see a guy like John Herrmann earn that quality, and develop that assurance as he goes on.
One of the things that I liked about the Herrmann character, at least the way I saw him and the way that I wrote him, was that although he was all of those things you just mentioned, a little bit a cut above, and he earned and deserved the Enterprise captaincy, he wasn't the same as Kirk, and he wasn't the same as Rachel Garrett, and he wasn't the same as Jean-Luc Picard. He was a little bit different, and I've written him in a couple of novels now, and actually at the end of the first novel I had him in, Serpents Among the Ruins, he actually steps down from command of the Enterprise. And that's not something I think you could ever see Captain Kirk doing willingly,
right.
or Captain Picard or anybody else. I mean, Rachel Garrett's taken her ship back into the lion's den in yesterday's Enterprise, and is quite likely going to die, and does die, but she's not stepping down. She's doing what she has to do. But Herrmann is a different sort of cat, and he's going on with his life in a different direction. And it's not that he doesn't love the Enterprise or his crew or Starfleet or any of that. He just has other things going on too. And I liked exploring those different sorts of motivation for an Enterprise captain, for any starship captain.
Right. I should mention, too, in the short story Full Circle by Scott Pearson, who's a former guest on the show, Herrmann is like a admiral. He's the sort of the liaison to the Starfleet Corps of Engineer, and he basically steps down from that job as well. He hands it over to Montgomery Scott, saying that he'd be a better sort of fit for the job. So yeah, that's an interesting quality to have from somebody who's in command, like the ability to be retiring and the ability to understand not just the capabilities of your crew, but what you can handle too, or where you can best be used by an organization.
And also what you want for your life, too, because we saw, I think, with Captain Kirk, certainly, and with Jean-Luc Picard and other Enterprise captains, we saw a measure of loneliness.
Yeah.
Captain Kirk is married to Enterprise. We see that from the beginning. And although he did have his love interest throughout the show, you got that sense from him that he was a loner, that he was not ready to give up command of the ship because that was his life. But Herrmann, when he steps down from the command of the Enterprise, it's largely for love, and it's a romantic relationship he's been involved in for a while, and he just makes the decision after a lot of things that have gone on, some of them involving his relationship with his father, that it's time for him to do this right at that moment most important thing in his life, which is be with the woman that he loves.
Right.
And that does continue, and Scott has his wife, Amina, in Full Circle. And I wrote him later than that in a novel called One Constant Star, in which he is, and he's an admiral still in Starfleet, and he's still married to the same woman, and he's got other responsibilities, and he actually has to get involved in an adventure to rescue Demora Sulu and her crew. But he's still in Starfleet. He's just he's moved around. He's doing the things that he wants to do, as long as it also lets him be with the woman that he loves.
Right.
So I like so he's an exception to the sort of Enterprise captain rule of somebody who's a loner, who's somebody who has to just separate out emotionally everything else from the command of that ship. He's not like that. And I enjoyed seeing a different take on that.
Yeah, that's really great. Well, we should be talking about generations as much as we're talking about Herrmann, but we're not. We're talking about the Corbomite Maneuver. Can you tell me why you wanted to discuss this episode?
But in a small part because it was the first episode I ever saw, and just drew me right into Star Trek.
Sure.
But also, I think because it's an absolutely underappreciated episode. And it's also a bit of a different sort of Star Trek episode, and you already touched on this in your intro, in that it was the very first episode ever produced during the regular run of the series. They produced the Cage pilot with Jeffrey Hunter as Captain Pike, and then they produced the second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, with William Shatner introducing Captain Kirk. But once the show was bought, this was the first episode ever produced. Now, they didn't even, as you said, air it until number 10 in the first season.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really stand out, at least from the viewpoint of how it aired, as a first episode. But if you watch it, there are a number of things in the episode that really make you think, oh, yeah, I can see they're trying to establish something that now, 50 years later, everybody takes for granted.
Right, yeah. It's amazing how they already sort of knew, I think, where they were going. Yeah, maybe somebody's shirt is a different color, but they certainly had a strong idea for what the series was going to be going forward. So we are talking about the Corbomite Maneuver. It first aired on November 10th in 1966. It was written by Jerry Soule, who also wrote The Side of Paradise and Whom Gods Destroy for the original series. It was directed by Joseph Sargent, who is a veteran director of many episodes of the original series, and he also directed episodes of Bonanza, Gunsmoke, The Fugitive, Man from U.N.C.L.E., a lot of shows at the time. The star date for this episode is 1512.2. And it's interesting in this episode that stardates really get a going over, because we sort of follow the action minute by minute, sometimes literally, so we get to see those kind of tick up. And this episode was also nominated for a Hugo Award in 1967 for Best Dramatic Presentation. Your mission, if you can, is to give us a 25-word synopsis of the Corbomite Maneuver.
Wow, I didn't know there was going to be homework.
Yes, there is a test.
The Enterprise, for the first time, meets the unknown and deals with it from a perspective of diplomacy over violence. That, to me, is really something that that episode established. Now, I know, again, it didn't air till number 10 in the first season, but it was that first episode produced, and they really, really focused on the fact that Kirk, especially, in command of the ship, is absolutely calm through this encounter, possibly very dangerous, with an unknown and apparently powerful alien force. And he doesn't panic. His first move is not to fire phasers. It's let's talk. Let's stay here. Let's wait and talk amongst ourselves. We can't get them to talk to us. Let's talk amongst ourselves and see what we want to do about this.
Sure.
Nobody's firing phasers. Nobody's wanting to engage in unnecessary violence. It's not why they're out there.
Right.
And I think that's really, really well established in this episode.
Sure. That was great. I think you nailed the synopsis and a little bit of commentary at the end, but that was good. Don't want to limit me to 25 words. I'm writing 135,000-word novels. I do what I can. As we mentioned, this was the first episode to be produced in regular production, and as such, it does contain a lot of firsts. That is, things that we're technically seeing for the first time out. Clearly, we see them when The Man Trap airs as the first sort of episode that was premiered. But this is the first time we see a lot of these elements outside of the first two pilots that were produced. Here's a list of some of those elements. It's the first appearance of Dr. McCoy and his first utterance of his variation of his catchphrase about being a doctor or not being a doctor. It's the first appearance of Uhura as communications officer, and the first time her line, Hailing Frequencies Open, is heard. She's also in a gold command uniform for this episode. She's also seen in gold for Mudd's Women, and the Man Trap, of course, is the first time we see her in red. It's the first appearance of Yeoman Rand. And it's the first time we hear the sound effects that are usually under bridge scenes. The first time the phasers are fired. It's the first appearance of the black collared tunics that are the main uniforms. It's also the first appearance of skirts and looser necklines on the female uniforms. I think Sally Keller was in slacks for Where No Man Was Gone Before.
She was.
Speaking of uniforms, it's the first appearance of red shirts, though none of them die in this episode. Sulu's in gold after appearing in blue as an astrophysicist in Where No Man Has Gone Before. It's the first time that we hear the famous opening narration by Shatner over the credits, and it's the first time we hear the Spock say fascinating. And I think the story behind that is that the script originally called for fear from Spock when he sees the view screen. I believe it's when he sees Baylock. But the director, Sargent, suggested, don't sell it. Give him nothing. Just give us no emotion and fascinating instead. And of course, that went on to really define him as a character.
One thing that Spock also does in that episode that's sort of interesting, that ties into what you're talking about, is at one point Kirk is asking for advice and Spock doesn't really give him something, and Kirk takes him to task for it, and Spock starts to apologize. He starts to say, I'm sorry, but he stops himself. Almost like he's the Fonz and just can't get out the words. But it's clearly something different than that. It's something... I think it's obviously him not wanting to engage in a human ritual that reflects emotion.
Right.
But then he also says, well, I regret that I can't give you any more information. I'm like, well, really? You're not going to say I'm sorry, but you can say I regret? There's not a lot of gradation there.
Right. Well, for a Vulcan, apparently there is.
Apparently there is.
They're still kind of nailing down, and this happens in a lot of the first half of the first season, there's kind of nailing down his character still, because we get a little sort of smile out of him when he and Kirk have their kind of wry exchange. Yeah. And, I kind of like that. I mean, we always talk about how Dr. Spock is so cold and emotionless, but he is half human, and I think it's okay for him to sort of, sure, he can fight with Dr. McCoy about how, heartless he is, but I like it when a little bit slips out.
Well, one of my original series novels, which is called The Fire and the Rose, is largely a Spock novel, and I really wanted to explore Spock as an alien, because in the show, we're constantly being told by Spock that, hey, I'm not human, I'm Vulcan,
right.
Even though he's a hybrid, but he favors his Vulcan heritage and is the Vulcan way of life. But he also constantly acts in contravention of that. Right. You do see the occasional smile. He professes his very real friendship with Kirk and McCoy and all of these things. So I really wanted to get in and dig into Spock as an alien character, which I did that in The Fire and the Rose, and I had great fun doing it because it's sort of an aspect of the character you don't see. And while we do see Spock's inner conflict, it's mostly just simply that yes or no, human, not human kind of thing. And I wanted to get in there a little bit more. One of the things we also see for the first time in this episode, some of the technical things, the contact with an alien vessel ahead or an object ahead sets off the red light on the helm and navigation console.
Sure.
They established that. When they talk about phasers for the first time, I think it's Bailey who mentions phasers for the first time, he calls them phaser weapons. Because, of course, nobody knows what a phaser is. Right? Because this was the first episode produced. Right. And later he actually refers to them as phaser guns. So, I mean, they wanted to establish that. Yeoman Rand talks about when she heated up coffee with a hand phaser, so now she's letting the audience know that they have portable versions of this ship weapon. One of the things that they also established in this episode, I think, is that's sort of lost in subsequent Star Trek episodes, especially later series like The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, is that the sense of the unknown. Because this episode is really steeped in the unknown because it's the first time, theoretically, that the audience would be seeing any of this stuff. Because it was the first one aired, you'd think it would be the first one. I mean, if this was the first one produced, you'd think it might be the first one aired. So we're getting this combination of life aboard a starship being sort of not mundane, but there's an everyday workaday sort of aspect to it. Kirk's getting a physical, his quarterly physical. They're on the bridge, kind of board mapping stars. And so there's this workaday aspect to it. But then we encounter this alien, and it's a really, really well done sort of sense of otherness and the unknown. And, of course, the guest character, the navigator, Bailey, it's a little rough on him. And we find out in the episode that Kirk has promoted him maybe faster than he should have, at least according to McCoy. And McCoy indicates that it's because Kirk sees a little bit of himself in Bailey.
Yes.
So Bailey's been pushed ahead maybe too quickly, and he doesn't want to die, and at some point this is a real possibility for him. So it's interesting to see that and playing that whole, not just the unknown, but the fear of the unknown. Whereas the other characters, especially Kirk and Spock, much more sort of cerebral about it, and much more, as I said before, anti-violence. They take a very decidedly diplomatic approach to things. Or if not diplomatic, at least a sort of a wait-and-see approach, which is not... It's a major theme in Star Trek, all of that. We'll talk first before we decide to shoot. But it's really, really, really obvious in this episode and really well established.
Yeah, I really like Kirk's speech to the crew about sort of the unknown, where he says to the effect of, things are only unknown until we know them. We're out here to discover things, and so we don't have to be afraid of things. We're going to find things out and move forward, which is really kind of what the whole show's about.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I also really enjoy when we get to see the workings of the ship, like you mentioned. You get the real feel of a military crew going through their routine, and it's emphasized, of course, in this episode in a big way. I also like when, after Kirk orders the phaser drill, he's chilling with McCoy, but he's still listening in to the crew going through the exercise. And I'm not a huge military or space military fiction fan, because I tend to really enjoy the humanistic elements of Trek. But I think this episode shows that those military fiction elements are baked in, and they always will be in the franchise going forward. But they're not overemphasized. I
completely agree with you, and I am of the same bent. I'm not a military science fiction fan. I guess it has its place, obviously, and in sort of a real world type of viewpoint, you need that. But Kirk says more than one time, not in this episode, but he certainly implies it in this episode. But he says it in subsequent episodes that he's an explorer, right? He's not he doesn't consider himself a military man. He's an explorer, and really, that's what you want out of Starfleet. I mean, that's what I want out of Starfleet anyway.
Yeah, me too.
In the novels, not just my novels, but in the 24th century novels that have come out over the last few years, there was something called the Typhon Pact, which is an alliance of the Romulans and the Gorn and the Tholians and 6 different nation states, sort of kind of an anti-federation. And there's a lot of martial writing, martial plots in a lot of the more recent novels, and we, as the writers and the editors, have made a really concerted effort to get back on track as Starfleet are explorers.
Okay.
Because, you have the big action adventures, from a military standpoint, and that's fine, they have their place, but to me, and I think to a lot of other writers and editors, and certainly readers and fans, that's not what Star Trek is.
Yeah.
And so we've really, really tried to get back to that exploratory kind of mission.
Yeah, go read Honor Harrington if you want some of that.
Exactly, right. Yeah, sure.
Nothing wrong with those books. Before this episode aired, there was no definitive date at which the series was set in terms of the year. In this episode, Kirk does say that humans have been traveling in space for over 200 years, and production designer on The Next Generation, Michael Okuda, would develop a timeline for the entire canon at Roddenberry's request. And he was able to use Kirk's remark to sort of place this where it is in sort of, our real world reckoning of time as 2066, which also is a nod, I'm sure, to when the series was released in 1966.
Sure.
And fun fact, Jonathan Goldsmith, who is better known as the most interesting man in the world, the Dos Equis spokesman, it does appear briefly in the episode as an unnamed crewman extra.
Does he?
Yes.
Where?
That is a good question. I spent a lot of time, because I knew this fact, and I spent a lot of time on Google Images before I prepared for the show, trying to find this, and I was not able to find it, but apparently he does.
It's really interesting because there are a number of extras who appeared throughout the original series, sure. But especially in that first season, people who recurred, who were there as background a lot. I mean, Eddie Paskey, who was William Shatner's stand-in, right, and who would ultimately play Lieutenant Leslie. I mean, he's in it so much that there are times when he's in, like, on the bridge, and then they cut to a corridor somewhere because a ship has been shot at, and the crew's being thrown about, and he's one of the crew being thrown about.
Yeah, right.
So, I mean, he's in multiple places in the ship at the same time. So, and I recognize these faces, and some of them you can research and get names to, and other people have done that. But some of them remain completely unknown, at least as far as I've been able to find out. Because I wrote an original series trilogy called Crucible in 2006, where they came out in 2006, 2007, that celebrated the 40th anniversary of the show. And I wanted to steep my books in the original series. And so I knew a lot already, but I paid a lot of attention to those. They're not even secondary characters, tertiary, quaternary characters.
Right.
I mean, they're really not even characters. They're more like furniture because they're just there in the background. And so I noticed while I watched this episode, the Corbomite Maneuver, this week in anticipation of being on your show, I was paying very strict attention to those background actors. Mm-hmm. And there were some that I recognized. None of them I would have recognized. Maybe I couldn't recognize him as the most interesting man in the world. What is his name? Goldsmith?
Jonathan Goldsmith, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to have to look again, because there is one scene toward the beginning where Kirk is gets out of sickbay, and he's walking to a turbo lift where there's a lot of movement in the corridor.
Yes.
Where you see a lot of guys. I have to look at that again, because I'm not sure where else he would be. Was this his only appearance on the original series?
As far as I know, yeah.
Then it can't be any of the guys that I've seen and recognized.
Right, you probably wouldn't. Recognize him.
Yeah, so I'm going to have to. I bet you it's that where Kirk is in the corridor headed. And where did you find this out? I mean, are we sure that this is true?
It's on Memory Alpha, so I'm taking it as truth.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because sometimes people, I mean, it may well be true, and I think it's fascinating if it is. And how much more interesting does that make this man? But
that's right. And if anything, it's a missed opportunity because in a lot of those commercials, they would have shots of him, younger him, hunting salmon with bears and all these different scenes. So if they just slipped in a little Star Trek in there.
Yeah, that would have been fantastic. People would have just thought they green screened it or something. But
right, yeah, exactly.
But if it were actually true, I'm going to have to look at that because that's a fascinating bit of trivia. But it's also the kind of thing where somebody might see somebody who resembles him and jumps to the conclusion and just makes that statement on Memory Alpha. I'm not saying that's what happened, but I'm going to be skeptical until I can confirm this. But I think it's fascinating.
Well, the show changed greatly, not just from pilot to series, but this script itself went through many changes from its initial concept as Danger Zone by Zoll to the final draft, and changes were made even from the final draft to when it was shot. Originally, Bailey was to be the communications officer before the addition of Lieutenant Uhura. There were also a lot of character bits that were added in the later stages, like the references to chess and poker, Kirk's having to eat salad, the reference to Spock's father. So it was clear that they were still working things out. And I think that's really evidenced by the fact that the crew in this episode meets a representative of a society called the First Federation, when the show itself doesn't really establish that Starfleet is the navy of the Federation, the United Federation of Planets, until late in the first season. It's be a little confusing.
Right, they don't mention the Federation in that episode, and as you say, not till the end of the first season. But also, when Kirk refers to the Enterprise, when he introduces himself via subspace radio to Baylock, he says, I'm of the United Earth ship.
Yeah, which I don't think is ever used again on the show. Before
they established Starfleet and the Federation, they called it the United Earth Space Probe Agency, and Kirk also refers to it sometime by that acronym, the United Earth Space Probe Agency, UESPA. He calls it USPA.
Right.
Which, if you're not really paying attention, or even if you are, it's hard to sort of catch and really understand what that. Wait, what? What's that word? What is he talking about?
Right.
So yeah, they haven't established those things, but the character bits, those things are going to come up in a first episode, in the first few episodes, because they really are trying to establish how these characters relate to one another.
Yeah, and this episode was originally to air much earlier in the first season, but there were clearly a lot of visual effect shots depicting the Viserys and the glowing cube and all that sort of thing. So it was pushed later in the schedule.
Is that why it was pushed? I've always wondered about that. I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. I mean, just at the time, I think that was a lot of effect shots for a show, Star Trek or a sci-fi show at the time.
Right, of course, and I also think that Star Trek's effects, even though they can look dated now, they really were state-of-the-art at the time, and certainly for television.
Oh, yeah.
But on top of that, I understood, and now this may not have to do directly with the Corbomite Maneuver, but I understand that the network really wanted the man trap because of the so-called salt vampire, which, was their idea of science fiction,
right.
Show us a creepy monster,
rubber monsters, right,
and Spock bleeding green,
right.
That's what they wanted, which I think. I mean, The Man Trap is a fine episode. It's got some interesting themes to it, but I wouldn't call it one of the stronger episodes.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an odd choice for that first episode, and at the same time, the Corbomite Maneuver, had it been ready and had it been able to air, I think really would have established that being out there, that being on the absolute edge of the frontier, that wagon train to the stars sort of approach. And actually, the very first scene when they're on the bridge mapping stars and Bailey's sort of complaining about the humdrum nature of it to Spock, Bailey says, somebody has to have mapped these stars before, and Spock says, no, we are the furthest out of any ship ever. And I mean that you're putting you right on the frontier. They're letting you know, hey, we're the first ones out here.
Yeah. There's also, speaking of Spock, I feel like he's a little more ruddy than he is in later episodes in this. He's got sort of that sort of greenish cast, but there's a little more color in his cheeks. I think in this first episode than he usually looks like later on.
I think you're right. Now, I didn't notice that, but having just watched the episode, now that you mention it, I think you're right.
Yeah. It had to be difficult as a faithful viewer in this era of television to tune into your new favorite show and see things being different or weirdly non-sequential week to week. I mean, we're 30 years away from The Sopranos and the rise of serialized stories in TV. And the reset in this decade was everything. You know, you wanted to tune in every week and see that, yep, those Robinsons they're still lost in space.
Right, right.
But I always enjoy it when Trek gets a chance in this era to draw on its own sort of quickly growing history. Of course,
Didn't do it often.
Yeah, and the episodes that aired right after this were, of course, Menagerie Parts 1 and 2, which I'm sure the production saw as a way to recoup the cost on the original pilot, The Cage.
Sure.
But we already get a sense that this is a world with a history that's being built.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and it's really interesting, too, that, I wonder, especially because you mentioned the special effects and the cost and the length of time it took to do them for the Corbomite Maneuver. I also wonder about other things that I don't know, things about the production itself, like how did it go over budget? Did it go over time? One of the reasons I wonder if it went over time is because there are some really interesting camera shots in the Corbomite Maneuver that you don't see repeated in the show, or at least not very often. I mean, one of the early shots in the very first scene is an overhead shot of the bridge that tracks from Spock's console, moves up, encompasses Sulu and Bailey at the helm and navigation consoles, and then zooms in to Bailey pressing a button. And it's a beautiful shot, but you don't see that very often in the show.
No, they're certainly establishing, the bridge and sort of the world and setting that we're going to see these characters go through for years and years. There are a lot of interesting camera moves. We also get the this is before Steadicam, so it's the not so steady POV shot as we see Kirk exit the turbolift. And he comes
right, that's a great shot too. Yeah, absolutely.
And we see in that shot that they were using double doors on the turbolift.
Yes,
like
I noticed that
elevator.
too.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
But they scrapped that, I think, after the first episode because they're like, what a hassle. We don't need to do that. Just have one set of doors.
Well, it's also interesting, too, what you mentioned about seeing things out of sequence because, okay, here there are two doors, but then not before that and not after that. And, of course, the third episode that was ever aired was the second pilot, which looked vastly different.
Yeah, totally different.
The ships, the uniforms, Spock,
different doctor. Yeah.
Everything. Yeah, the doctor was different. So, yeah, just... but, obviously 50 years ago, if you wanted to watch an episode of a television show, you better watch it when it's on.
Right.
Right? Because, I mean, if you're lucky, you might get to see it one more time in the next year.
Right.
And Star Trek was I think, a pioneer in the notion of syndication, right? I mean, Star Trek was one of the very first series to be so wildly successful in syndication. And I think it was one of the first shows that was really syndicated.
Yeah, it opened the way for a lot of those shows. The production went through a lot of changes. The script went through a lot of changes. And I'm curious, as somebody who's written the story for a Star Trek episode and then had the teleplay drawn up by other writers, can you talk about the process and the input that you have into the final form the draft takes?
Well, it's an interesting question, and my experience with it is limited. But, I did co-write a story for the first season Voyager episode, Prime Factors. It was... Depending on how you count the first episode, is either a 1 2-hour episode or 2 1-hour episodes. It was the 10th, either the 9th or the 10th episode, the 10th hour of Voyager.
Sure.
And, we went in with a very specific idea, which was to establish that the Prime Directive, which I think is a spectacular part of Star Trek, because, it really demonstrates how it's very Swiftian in its the way it plays. It's just Jonathan Swift, was not talking about the Lilliputians, he was talking about the British government. And we're talking about Starfleet's Prime Directive, but we're really talking about Vietnam. So, and the episode Prime Factors that we pitched was that maybe the Prime Directive is a double-edged sword. Maybe another race that you need something from has their own Prime Directive, and because of that, it's not going to help you. Uh-huh. And that was where the crux of the episode is that, okay, we've run across a race that has very powerful transporter technology that could get us, if not all the way home, a huge portion of the way back to the Alpha Quadrant.
Right.
But hey, you know what? They have their own Prime Directive, so they're not going to give it to you.
Right.
And so, okay, the Captain Janeway in this case, that's the way it goes. She accepts it. some of her crew do not, and so there's a little bit of, not a full-blown mutiny, but there are some mutinous actions taken. Some orders are violated, so they're not obeyed. We pitched that story, and we were asked to clarify and change some things in the story, and we did that, and went back with it, and we sold it, and then the episode was, in our case, just given to a pair of writers that the producers were actually essentially auditioning to become staff writers.
Okay.
So they wanted to see what these guys could do.
Right.
Weren't quite as interested in what I could do or what my co-writer could do, but which was fine. I mean, that's the business. And so after that, we did not have a great deal of input into what the show was going to look like. I mean, they changed the name of the aliens that we had come up with and other incidental details like that. Although the story that came out was largely our story. Okay. And I think that's reflected, it is reflected in the fact that the teleplay is by this writing team, and the story credit is just Eric and me. So had they changed considerably from our initial idea, the story would have been by the four of us.
I'm curious as well, when you write a Lost Era novel or something like DS9 that's in continuity, how does that develop? Are you pitching stories to your publisher and they greenlight you then to write about John Herrmann or their characters, or are they soliciting stories from you about specific settings?
It depends. Mostly, the first time actually that I ever pitched anything to Simon & Schuster, who for the last 20-plus years has owned, it might even be 30 years by now, has owned... has had the licensing rights to publish Star Trek novels. Armin Shimmerman, who played Quark on Deep Space Nine, unlike a lot of other actors, wasn't so interested in directing. He wanted to write. And in fact, he had co-written a novel called The Merchant Prince, which was a sort of half Shakespeare, half science fiction sort of novel, which it was terrific. And he wanted to write, so my co-writer on Prime Factors, Eric Stillwell, and he knew Armin, and the three of us got together and we came up with a number of stories that we pitched to Deep Space Nine and did not sell. And on our way out of the Hart Building, where the production offices were, Armin said, we should write a novel. And Eric was like, he wasn't interested in that. And I was like, yeah, sure. Although I've always wanted to be a novelist, I was like, yeah, right. But I found out the name of the editor at Simon & Schuster, who was doing the Star Trek novels at that time, and I called up and I tried to sell it by saying, hey, how'd you like to have one of the actors' name on a book?
Right.
And this editor, John Ordover, said, yeah, that'd be great, but you're still going to have to go through the same process as anybody else, which was give me a narrative outline that describes the beginning, middle, and end of the story, and all of the character arcs and thematic elements. And once you've done that, and I say it's okay, then you'll write 2, 3, 4 chapters, whatever, 50 pages or so of the novel, and I'll look at that, and if I, think that you're capable, then we'll talk about signing you. So Armin and Eric wasn't interested, so Armin and I sat down for a couple of weeks and expanded the story, one of our stories, tremendously, because writing, a 51-minute or 42-minute episode of a television series is vastly different than writing a 100,000-plus word book.
Yeah, you're right.
A lot more plot, a lot more complexity, or at least the opportunity for a lot more complexity. So Armin and I, over a few weeks, greatly expanded the story, wrote the outline. This was the late 90s, so I actually faxed it to Mr. Ordover. And 15 minutes later, he called me and said, okay, we'll buy the book. I'm like, well, wait a minute, what about the chapters that you want? He said, yeah, from your outline, I know you guys can write.
Nice.
So, yeah, it was great. And so we wrote the 34th Rule. Actually, mostly I wrote the 34th Rule because, as I said, Armin had written a novel before. Mm-hmm. And so our plan was I wrote the first chapter, and then I gave it to him, and he was going to change it, add to it, whatever, help make it his own. But he actually, I wish I had this message. He left a message on my answering machine when he read the first chapter and said, this is a thing of beauty. I don't need to change a word. It was fantastic. And so then we went to the second chapter, and he said the same thing. And then by the third chapter, he's like, just write the novel. And the only reason I'm saying this in public is because I've heard Armin say it in public so many times. And I used to counsel him, don't say that. Your name's on the book. And, I mean, it is his story, too. I mean, we did sit down and write the story together.
Sure.
Anyway, so I wrote that book, and then subsequent to that, pretty much Simon & Schuster has come to me and asked me if I wanted to write a Star Trek novel. And sometimes it's just, hey, what do you want to pitch to us? What do you feel like telling us? Sometimes it's, hey, we would like a novel with Captain Sisko and Mr. Spock. And we want Sisko's back from his sojourn in the Celestial Temple that he took at the end of the series. Now he's in the books he's back. So we want to get him back in Starfleet. So do that. So sometimes I get those sort of edicts that they those sort of plot points that they'd like to see. But and I think all of the writers have a really, really great deal of freedom in coming up with stories and being able to do whatever helps us tell the best stories we can. And that includes things like killing canon characters, which you don't see a lot of in a lot of different franchises. But we've had some great editors. John Ordover only edited my first book. For a half a dozen books after that, it was a man named Marco Palmieri, who's a fantastic editor. And then for, I think, 11 books, a woman named Margaret Clark, who I just finished working with on a novel that'll be out in December called Original Sin. But both of them, especially Marco and Margaret, they know their Star Trek. They love it. They have a good sense of what makes a good Star Trek story, but they're also really, really good editors. Regardless of it being Star Trek. And
sure.
Yeah, I don't know if some writers have adversarial relationships with their editors, but I absolutely do not, because I, especially with Marco and Margaret, just completely trusted them. They make my work better, which you can't argue with that.
As a writer, I'm interested in your opinion about the existence of, or the suggestion of the existence of Corbomite. Corbomite appears in this story, and of course it appears in a later episode as well. And it's a device. It's a literal device in the script, but it's also a sort of story device that is used to sort of get them out of the situation. It's kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card. Like, do you think that it's a good device in the telling of this story?
You know, it's the kind of thing, that kind of a bluff has been used a great deal, I'm sure, before and certainly since. But it works for me not as much as in the role of a story device as in the role of a character device. Because I think it really is, I think it's really revelatory. That's too grandiose a term. But I think it does reveal aspects of Spock's character and Kirk's character, and how they come at things from different perspectives. I mean, Spock is the ultimately analytical individual, and Kirk, while you would say McCoy is the overly emotional one, Kirk is in between. I mean, he's certainly a rational individual who considers logic, but he also trusts his gut. And I think we get those sorts of character moments from the whole poker, chess, Corbomite bluff sequence. I think that's really a lot of the reason that's in there. It also demonstrates, too, Kirk's sort of, bravado is not the right word, but, I mean, he is brash, and he has a sense of people's motivations, even if those people are aliens, because he's a starship commander. He needs to be able to make deductions and draw conclusions about people with whom he deals, even if he doesn't know them. And so he says to Baylock, "Death has little meaning to us. If it has none to you, kill us now. Don't wait. You're going to die too. But let's do this thing." Right. But he certainly fully expects that's not going to happen.
Right. Yeah. It's also, I just think that it's baked into the episode in a superior way, with, like you mentioned, the metaphor of chess and poker, and they're not just using it to, we got to get away from the Romulans somehow. We've got a Corbomite device, near the end of the episode. Like, it's really central to what's going on.
Well, and it's funny because in later Star Trek series and in later Star Trek episodes, you get the Technobabble, right? That solves it, which is essentially a deus ex machina. But in this episode, the technology doesn't even really exist. I mean, in future series, they'll give you some grand explanation of some science fiction concept that actually gets them out of some danger. But here, it gets them out of danger, but doesn't really exist.
It's not even real, yeah.
Yeah, and what's the key here is the bluff, is Kirk's understanding of the motivations of the person he's facing, and also he, by doing all of this, takes control of the situation.
Yes.
Right? To this point, Enterprise has been toyed with. The crew has been toyed with, and now Kirk's had enough. And this is one way he takes control again. I think it works as, like I say, more of a character device, but it is baked into the episode in a superior way. It really flows very well.
Yeah, there's a real tension to the episode, too. And I like the idea of when we get in the show, like the two commanders trying to outwit each other. Mm-hmm. We kind of return possibly to those sort of military aspects, but you get the idea of, Balance of Terror, which is a wonderful episode, is probably the best example of that. It's almost Das Boot in space. These two commanders trying to outwit each other. Yeah. And I always love a good old countdown to destruction, a ticking clock, which is central in this episode.
It's in the Herrmann novel that I wrote, the first Herrmann novel, Serpents Among the Ruins. There's which is something that was mentioned in Star Trek: The Next Generation, the so-called TOMED incident, which was like one of the last things that drove the Federation and the Romulans apart, and so they hadn't seen each other between Kirk's time and Picard's time. The Serpents Among the Ruins is the telling of what that is, what the TOMED incident was, and there's a real ticking clock aspect to it, so much so that my prologue is called Countdown, and then the next 10 chapters are 10, -10, -9, -8, -7. So, yeah, I mean, I'm with you on the ticking clock.
Well, let's talk about the little bald kid in the low-ceilinged room.
Yeah.
This episode, of course, features Clint Howard as the real face of the alien Baylock. Howard was 6 or 7 at the time this was filmed, but he had 13 credits on his resume before Star Trek. He had an entire season of The Baileys of Balboa under his belt.
Wow.
And he had done, he had done 5 Andy Griffiths, I think, before that. So he was quite accomplished for his age as a young actor.
Well, I think he did a fine job.
He was great.
I mean, he was. So it's hard to tell because he was looped by. Is that Vic Perrin or?
Surprisingly, no, it's not. It's Walker Edmiston, who was a actor and a voiceover artist. He had his own children's show, the Walker Edmiston Show, and he worked on several Sid and Marty Krofft projects as well.
I didn't know that. I think I always sort of assumed it was Vic Perrin because it kind of sounds like him.
It'd be a logical choice, yeah.
And Vic Perrin actually, I mean, I'm sure Star Trek fans maybe have seen his name here and there in the credits, but he did a lot of voices, but he also was an actor who played one of the Halkins in Mirror, Mirror, and he acted. I've seen him in Mission Impossible episodes, and actually, I don't know what happens, but sometimes I guess somebody's voice in a Mission Impossible episode didn't sit well with the producers, and Vic Perrin looped entire episodes of dialogue for an actor.
Wow.
Fascinating stuff. But at any rate, the sync between Clint Howard's mouth and the voice, I think, is beautiful. And it really helps. I mean, they went in the menagerie, the menagerie too, but in the cage, they went with elderly women to play the Telosians.
Telosians, yeah.
And now, of course, they're going with a 6-year-old boy to play Baylock. But it works. It really demonstrates it's one way to demonstrate the alienness of something without having to do it via CGI, which, of course, didn't exist at the time, really. So, to me, it was great. And it was, when you first see Baylock's alter ego, the puppet that appears, that Spock manages to get a shot of, on the main view screen. It's alien and strange looking, sort of demonic looking, and when it moves its head back and forth, it looks like a doll. It looks like a puppet. And I just have to wonder if people watching it for the first time way back in 1966 were thinking, well, that's terrible. That looks like a puppet. But, of course, it's supposed to be a puppet.
Okay.
As it turns out,
right.
it actually is a puppet. In the story, it's a puppet. So, but
right.
I like the fact that, they're told to bend down. It reads pretty cramped over on Balok's ship, and then it turns out that he's, he looks like a 6-year-old boy, except a bald one. I thought they did a great job with the bald cap too, because they put the adornment around his head that hid any lines that might have showed. It would have ruined the illusion.
Yeah, it looks pretty good.
Yeah, it looks pretty good. And again, this is 1966. This is 50 years ago. If you look at a show like Lost in Space at the time, and you compare the effects, and not just visual effects, but practical effects, like a bald cap or whatever, just Star Trek is so superior. I mean, I know it looks dated now, but it really, for its time, it was extremely good. And Star Trek was also one of the cheaper shows on television at the time in terms of budget. I mean, Mission Impossible was on at the same time and had twice the episodic budget. Which is crazy. To me, it's crazy. I mean, and you got to hand it to Joseph Sargent, who directed, because a lot of times, I mean, I guess you said Clint Howard had 13 credits, so he was already an established actor, so he knew what he was doing. But usually children's performances largely derive from a solid director.
Right, yeah. Balok's he's a weird little guy. He's an example of the type of alien the ship, especially in the original series, seems to run into a lot. A superior technologically advanced race. And it's always a chance for Kirk and crew, when they inevitably get the upper hand over said aliens, to show the ingenuity of humanity and also to reiterate those high-minded ideals. As you've mentioned before in the episode, they resist getting into a conflict whenever possible, and they even try to help Balok when they think he's in trouble at the end.
Yeah, I love that aspect of the show. Here's somebody who was trying to kill us, said that he was going to try and kill us. I don't think he really wanted. He was testing them and all that, but they don't know that at the time. And yet they're still going to try and help him. It's if you look at the Search for Spock, where Kirk is battling Krug on the planet that's being destroyed, and he sends Krug to the edge of a cliff, and Kirk goes to try and help him up, and Krug tries to pull him over so that they both die. And then Kirk's like, "I've had enough of you," and he kicks him off. I hated that. I loved that Kirk tried to help him, but I hate that it ended up where Kirk killed him. And you could argue that Kirk really didn't have a choice and all of that, but the writers did. And I thought, to me, the Klingons were a little, for my taste, they were a little too, sort of cartoon evil, twirling mustaches.
Well, Krug especially,
Yeah. So, I mean, that's just my taste, and I'm sure plenty of people loved it, but it just wasn't quite my thing. But I liked the fact that in the Corbomite Maneuver, here's somebody who certainly was adversarial, who stopped our ship from moving ahead, and then who threatened it, and explicitly threatened, said, "You got 10 minutes, then I'm going to kill you." And yet they go help him when he's in trouble. And I mean, that's a practical application of ideals, not just talking about them, right? And that's, I just love that. I mean, to me, that's the heart of Star Trek. People sometimes wonder why Star Trek has been popular for 50 years, and to me, it's no mystery. It's twofold. One, here's an optimistic view of the future, told by characters that we can relate to and who we love. I mean, it's that simple. And that optimistic vision of the future is an inclusive vision. It's not about tolerance. The word tolerance is fine, but to me it also sort of implies that, you're different from me, but I'm gonna put up with you. I'm gonna tolerate you. And I know that's not the sense of tolerance when people talk about tolerance, but I sort of prefer the word inclusiveness or inclusion, because everybody gets a seat at the table. Even though Uhura was a background character, even though Sula was a secondary character, hey, there's a black woman on the bridge in a position of authority. There's an Asian man on the bridge in a position of authority. These are really important things, especially for for 50 years ago, but you know what? It's still important now. My editor, Marco Palmieri, likes to say, pessimism is a misuse of imagination.
I like that.
I do too.
On that note, I think it's hard, maybe I'm out on a limb, but I think it's hard to not view this without looking at it in the light of like 60s Cold War politics. There's a lot of brinksmanship, in this episode. There's a literal doomsday device. Mm-hmm. Do you think it was the intention of the writer to parallel what was going on in the real world at the time?
I don't know about parallel, but reflect, certainly. Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. That's my guess. I could be completely wrong.
Sure.
But it seems like that, doesn't it? I mean, Star Trek was not shy about its politics. And
right.
It was not something that was a seldom used aspect of the show. I mean, how many times did they talk about the Prime Directive? And it was clear what they were talking about. So, yeah, my guess is that this had something to do with what was going on in the 60s. I mean, in 1966, November 1966, you said? So we're talking just a few years post-Cuban Missile Crisis, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Real-world brinksmanship. So, yeah, I do think that Jerry Soule probably had these things in his mind when he wrote this episode. I think probably Gene Roddenberry and the producers were actively looking for those sorts of stories.
It's possible. Balak also turns out to be something of a paper tiger. I mean, he's not even what we think initially what he looks like. He's small and imposing. So it's just a thought I had that in some way this is supposedly possibly representing Russia or somebody else that's sort of blustery. I mean, he offers him tranya instead of banging his shoe on a podium. Still.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting. That's an interesting perspective. I actually went to Russia for a few weeks.
Oh, wow.
Back in the 90s, for all reasons, to play baseball. And I'm a big baseball fan, and I still, to this day, play baseball. I love baseball. And a bunch of my friends, we had basically two teams of people. And so we went over to Russia. We set this up in advance. We went over to Russia we were there for about 3 weeks, and we only played 8. The two teams each played 4 games. So there was a lot of non-baseball stuff there, but we played their professional teams, and they were a bunch of 18-year-old decathletes. That's where they got their baseball players because they didn't grow up playing the game, and it was clear when we played them that they hadn't played the game. But they were also 6 foot 6 inch specimens.
Right.
Actually, for their pitchers, they recruited Olympic javelin throwers. It was amazing. It was a spectacular experience. But I bring this up because I didn't speak Russian. A lot of them spoke English, and we had a lot of time with these just average Russian citizens. I mean, not just the baseball players, but the people around that were hosting us, and people at the hotel, and all these places. And Russian citizens are like American citizens. I mean, these people are people. You've got the governments doing these kinds of things, but the people sort of. You got to think that, by and large, human beings, regardless of their national origin, really kind of want the same things. I think mostly happiness.
Right, yeah. He turns into, at least he appears as kind of an Epicurean guy. He invites them in. He's like, hey, hang out with me. Drink the tranya. Isn't it good? His
brinksmanship wasn't really brinksmanship unless he expected Kirk and company to fight back. He certainly, by scanning the ship, he determined early on that they were not a physical threat to him and to his ship. But then Kirk says, hey, well, maybe we are, by introducing the Corbomite device. But you have to think, when you think through the whole episode, it's like Balak, he wasn't going to the brink because he wanted to fight and he wanted to beat back adversaries. He wanted to make sure that the people that he allowed in were potential friends. And so he really that's what he just wanted to make sure about. And Kirk really demonstrates that to him, what that aspect of what he was looking for, which is that, we can be friends. The second season episode, By Any Other Name, where Enterprise is hijacked by the Andromedans and taken, toward that galaxy. The end of that episode, it doesn't end by Kirk and company defeating them physically, he says, "Look, we don't fight us. We'll welcome you." It's really
Right.
you do that. You do that for enemies. Rojan says, "No, but we
Yeah.
welcome friends." I mean, to me, that's all Star Trek.
Yeah, it's still an interesting technique, though. Clearly they want to have a positive exchange, but the way that they sort of go about that is they kind of bring the worst and see how you react to it. They get into a nacelle measuring contest, with other species. I don't really know the history of the First Federation. I know there's a Trek novel, The Face of the Unknown by Christopher Bennett, that delves more into it. But, Balok, he's kind of a capricious character. I think that entire strategy of testing new species makes me think that they're kind of concerned about how they look or their status. So I guess my sort of crackpot theory for this episode would be that maybe they heard about the Federation and they thought, let's be the first Federation. We've been around a while. You probably haven't heard of us.
That's funny. I hadn't thought of it that way. That's funny, though.
This is a eminently quotable episode, and they're really going for a lot of great character touches. And, of course, they managed to get the entire main cast on the bridge so they can all bounce off of each other.
Sure.
Do you have a favorite quote or exchange from this episode?
Well, of course, McCoy talking. If I reacted to every light that went off around here, I end up talking to myself, which he, of course, is
Right.
saying to himself.
No
Yeah,
one's in
it's
the
a little
room.
obvious, but it's fun and it's very McCoy.
Yeah. I like his exchanges with Kirk. They have this little bit that doesn't really continue into the series, but he keeps, saying all these aphorisms, and he's like, "You always say this." He's like, "No, I didn't say that."
Yeah,
I never said that."
those are great. You said a little suffering is good for the soul. I never say that. A man is ultimately superior to any. No, I never said that either. I'm pretty sure I heard you say that. Those were all great. All those character moments are really great. What I like, which is not a verbal exchange, I really like the way William Shatner's Captain Kirk watches Bailey on the bridge.
Yeah.
He's very measured in his observation of this officer that he's already been told by McCoy he may have promoted too quickly, and it's because you see yourself in him. So watching him watch Bailey, and he's not given Bailey enough rope to hang himself. He's given up Bailey enough rope to rescue himself. But then, of course, he goes too far, and he's got to relieve him. But then, Bailey comes back to the bridge, and Kirk's, hey, yep, take your position. Well, although that's a really interesting sequence, too. It doesn't bear up under much scrutiny because Balok gives him 10 minutes. And in that time, Bailey goes off the deep end. And that his what he says there when he's fearful and angry is a great sequence. What are you, robots?
Right.
Don't you know when you're dying? Oh, he's doing a he's doing a countdown over. It's all great, but it takes time. And then Bailey's relieved by Kirk. McCoy escorts him off the bridge. McCoy comes back, and then Bailey comes back. I'm like, that's a really busy 10 minutes.
Yeah, it's kind of compressed.
Yeah. So I'm saying, I guess he didn't make it all the way to his quarters, but
No, he turned around and
I think I can't even remember the actor's name right now who plays Bailey. Also did a very nice job. And I actually thought they should have brought him back at some point.
That would have been interesting to see him sort of come back like Wesley, coming back from the Traveler,
Right.
seeing what he learned from the First Federation. I wanted to mention really quick that Ted Cassidy did do the voice of the Balok's puppet.
Yeah. Actually, I was thinking about that when I watched the episode. I don't think I ever had that confirmed, but as I was watching the episode the other day, I'm like, that's Ted Cassidy.
Right. And him and the even when he plays Rook, he kind of looks like the puppet a little bit. It's like same same kind of tunic and same complexion.
And they've got him shadowed, his cheeks, hollowed.
Right.
With that shading. Yeah, that's funny.
That's a guy whose entire career is built on cheek shadowing, I think.
Yeah.
Between that and Lurch and everything else.
Right.
Well, as we wrap up here, did you have any last thoughts about the episode?
Well, I just think it's an episode that, as I said at the beginning, is underappreciated by fans. I think if people watch the episode again, try and keep it in context, which is to say that it was the first show ever shot. So not only is everything that happens, all of this unknown, part of what the crew deals with, it's a part of what the audience would have been dealing with as well, had this been the first episode aired. That we don't know anything about this ship, this crew, these characters, their situation, and we're learning it for the first time. It's really interesting to watch it through that prism, I think. It makes it more I don't know, it's sort of a more important episode, too, than I think people realize, because it does, as you've mentioned, establish a lot of things, both sort of technical things, character relationships. I just think it's a terrific episode, and people don't often see it because a lot of the stuff that happens in the episode sort of happened in different forms in other episodes later. So it's like, oh, we already know this story, but you know what? It's really good. I try and imagine this episode as the only episode of Star Trek. Right? I mean, just think about this. Let's say, nothing came before, nothing came after, and really, in large part, nothing did come before. But think about if this was just a 1-hour special on television, it still plays. It's still,
true.
It's internally consistent. It has everything it needs. It's got a beginning, a middle, and then it's got great character interaction. It professes high ideals. And then it follows through on those ideals. It really, in a lot of ways, for me, is quintessential Star Trek.
Me too. Let's talk My Space Dad Can Beat Up Your Space Dad. Who's your favorite captain and why?
I gotta say it's probably Captain Kirk, because that was my first captain, right? So,
sure.
But, I love Picard. I love Janeway and Sisko. I love all, you know what? I love them all. I love Herrmann.
Sure.
I think so the short answer is Kirk, but which one of your children do you like best? Because I've gotten
right. Long answer is it's a tough question. Right?
Well, I mean, I've gotten to write all of these characters too, and
sure.
They all.
Well, that's a good one. Which one is your favorite to write?
Probably Sisko.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because Sisko is. Maybe because I've known Kirk for so long, and his story is very sort of, and his personality is very sort of, if compared to the other ones, it's kind of simplistic. And actually, Sisko, I think, in relation to the other captains, is far more complex. And part of that is just the circumstances. But Michael Piller and Rick Berman gave a really textured landscape for Deep Space Nine, a really detailed background for the whole show, but in particular for Sisko. I mean, this man was a widower, right? We meet him, and he's a widower, a single father, and all of a sudden revered as an elite figure in an alien race's religion. It's kind of a lot of stuff to deal with.
Yeah, and of course that's all down to the advent of serialized storytelling on television.
Well, I think it's why some people who love Star Trek didn't quite like Deep Space Nine as much. I mean, certainly plenty of people who love Deep Space Nine, and I'm one of them.
Sure.
But it's a different sort of Star Trek. And I love Kirk. I say, he's my guy. He was just, I don't know, he's just always been my guy. I don't know, Sisko's sort of more fun to write because there's just so much more going on. He's a widower, and then he gets remarried, and he was a single father, and now now in the books he's also got a daughter, and now he's back on a starship, and all sorts of things going on with Sisko, and that's just, I don't know, I just really enjoy writing him. And I like, I actually, though I haven't written him anywhere near as much as I've written Sisko, Herrmann's a great deal of fun too because he's different than a lot of the other captains.
Well, now that we've reached the end of the show, you will receive a commission at the rank of ensign. What department on the ship would you work in?
I would have to say command, though my second choice, very close, would be sciences.
Sure.
Maybe I would like to command a science vessel.
Okay.
So I have a strong scientific background.
Combine those two things. How do you think people get their start in command when you're an ensign? Are you just getting people coffee? Do you start off as a yeoman or something like that?
I'm going to answer the question from a practical point of view,
sure,
rather than sort of, because I in my life I've just noticed that most people are not leaders. There are people who are sort of natural leaders who just take over situations, and I don't mean in a bad way. I mean they don't mind having responsibility thrust upon them, about being accountable for things, about telling people what to do in a good way. Trying to get a job accomplished, and being willing and able to do things themselves. And I think that must happen in Starfleet. Just trying, as I said, look at from a practical standpoint, that, as an ensign, they must give them responsibilities to demonstrate their leadership qualities, whether they maybe think they have them and then decide that that's not for them. You know, it's interesting because you get characters on Star Trek like Spock and Riker who kind of profess time and again they don't want to be captain. And I think there are a lot of people like that in real life, although they might not say that they don't want to be in charge. But I think a lot of people don't want to be in charge. And not for any other reason than it doesn't satisfy them, maybe because they know they wouldn't be good at it, or they can't handle the pressure, or any number of other reasons. And it's not a negative thing. It's good if you know yourself and you know, hey, here's a position that I don't belong in.
Right.
So, I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I'd say sort of. We've talked about Riker before on the show, and about how there's this constant sort of ongoing bit with him where he wants command, but he seems reluctant to take it. You know, he has the opportunity to transfer to the ships or whatever it is, and what's holding him back. And I don't think, sadly, the series kind of ends before they really get a chance to attack that. I think
they attack it a little bit in the books, at least insofar as in the books he now is in command of the USS Titan.
Sure.
But, when you watch it in the series, obviously, it's, again, one of those things that might be an artifact of the writing rather than a conscious, plot device used in the writing, which is that, obviously, they're not going to put Riker on another ship during the seventh season of Star Trek Next Generation. He's one of the freaking cast members. So they're not going to do that. But here's a dramatic situation. You can put him in. How do you get him out of that so he doesn't leave the ship? Well, I don't want command. I sort of always interpreted that as I don't want command right now under these circumstances. I'm happy where I'm at, and I don't want to leave these people. I mean, there's the episode where, I guess a Best of Both Worlds, where he says, where Troy says, look, you're comfortable here. Yeah, maybe too comfortable. She's like, I don't know what that means. right? And it's like, it's just something you say, right? But there may be some truth to that, too. And so they were trying to fit a plot, it was trying to fit a character around a plot device, which is we could be losing Riker, but of course we're never really going to. So how do we make the character, how do we mold him in a way that we serve the dramatic story but don't lose the character? It would have been more interesting to me, I think, if he said at some point we actually discerned that he really would not be a good captain. But of course he doesn't play like that because he really is Picard's right hand and he's in charge of a lot of stuff. So it seems like he would be a capable commanding officer.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Maybe that's something that will be explored in the upcoming Star Trek Discovery, because, of course, our central character is supposedly going to be an executive officer and not a commander, and a lot of fans theorize that, she may be taking control of the ship or be thrust into that command position as the show goes on.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
Thanks for joining me, Ensign George, to talk about Star Trek and the Star Trek universe. If people want to continue the conversation, and they can, at EISTpod on Twitter and the Enterprising Individuals Facebook page, where can people find you online?
All sorts of places. I would start at DRGIII. That's from my David R. George III. DRGIII.com. That's my website. I'm also on Facebook, Facebook.com/DRGIII. I'm on Twitter. I think that's David R. George III. I'm on Instagram, David R. George III. I'm on Tumblr. I'm all over the place. Twitter.
All over the place.
All these places.
Anything you can tell us about your upcoming novel?
Well, it'll be out it's a January book, which means it'll be out end of December. It's called Original Sin, and it will feature Captain Sisko, which I think has not been made public quite yet, and I hope my editor doesn't hear this and kill me. But that's the way it is.
I take no responsibility.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Me too. We are signing off until the next mission. Hailing frequencies closed.